She asked if I'd stay for coffee. I didn't know she had been waiting for years. The words came out of her the way water comes out of a spring in April. Small, ordinary, and older than either of us knew. I was standing on her porch in Silverpine, Colorado, with my hat in my hand and a cottonwood leaf caught in the brim from the walk up her lane. And for a second the whole San Juan range behind her seemed to hold its breath. She asked it plain. She asked it the way a woman asks a thing she has practiced saying, in the mirror, in the barn, in the dark. I said yes. I said yes because I had been waiting, too, and did not know it either. Ethan Calloway was 34 years old that autumn of 1889. 6 foot even, brown-eyed. The kind of quiet man a town notices only when a fence needs mending or a wagon axle snaps in a hard rain. He kept 120 acres 4 miles east of Silverpine, 60 head of cattle, a bay gelding named Miller, and a dog with one blue eye. His people were gone. His wife Sarah was 6 years in the ground up on the ridge above the creek. He had built the house himself the summer before she took sick, and every board in it still knew her hands. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. Clara Whitfield was 31 that same September, 5'4", dark hair pinned high in the old style, gray eyes the color of the creek in late light. She had come to Silverpine at 23, a widow already, having lost a husband to a mine collapse outside Durango and a child, a boy of 2, to fever the following spring. She wore long-sleeved calicos in the warm months and heavy wool in the cold, her collars buttoned to the throat, her skirts to the tops of her boots, the kind of dress a woman wears when she has decided modesty is a form of privacy. She kept the boarding house on 3rd Street, 6 rooms, a long kitchen, a garden that ran to the alley, and a coffee pot on the stove from 4 in the morning until 9 at night. She had waited a long time. She did not, on most days, know for what. I have to slow down here before I speed up, because to understand why she asked and why I said yes, you have to understand the Tuesdays. For 4 years running, I had ridden into Silverpine every Tuesday afternoon to deliver a crate of eggs to Clara's kitchen. 60 eggs, laid by hens I had bought as chicks from her cousin Nell in Pueblo the spring after Sarah died. That was how it began. A favor to Nell, who did not want the hens to travel farther east, and a favor to Clara, who did not want to buy eggs off the freight wagon like a stranger in her own town. 60 eggs, $2.40. A Tuesday. That was the ritual, and rituals in country towns are a kind of vow no one says out loud. I would leave the ranch after the morning chores, ride Miller the 4 miles in along the creek road, hitch him at the post outside her kitchen door, carry the crate through, set it on the long pine table, and she would give me $2.40 in coin, and I would tip my hat and I would go. That was 4 years. 208 Tuesdays. Give or take a few for blizzards and calving weeks. In 4 years I had said perhaps 400 words to Clara Whitfield, and she had said perhaps 400 back, and none of them had been about anything except eggs. Except once. Once, in the 2nd year, I had come in late, past supper, because a heifer had gone down in the west pasture and I had lost the afternoon getting her up. Clara was alone in the kitchen wiping down the stove. She looked at me and she said, "Quiet, you didn't have to come today. It's near dark." And I said, "It's Tuesday." And she looked at me another second and she said nothing, and I left. That was all. But I thought about that look a great many nights afterward, out on the porch of my empty house, and I did not know what it was I was thinking. Now it was September of 1889, a Tuesday like all the others, and I had come with the eggs. Clara took them, set them on the table, counted them the way she always did. She always counted. She trusted no crate blindly, not even mine, and then she did not go to the tin box on the shelf where she kept the coin. She stood at the table with her hands flat on the pine, and she looked up at me, and she asked if I'd stay for coffee. I said yes. I set my hat down on the bench by the door. He said, "That is the beginning." But of course it is not the beginning. The beginning was 4 years before, and further back than that, in ways neither of us could yet name. A ritual is a vow the town does not hear you take. And Silverpine, that autumn, had watched us take one every Tuesday for 48 months without either of us saying the word. Let me tell you about the town because the town matters. Silverpine in 1889 had 411 souls, a Catholic church and a Methodist one, a general store run by a widower named Halloran, a smithy, a schoolhouse, and a boarding house, Clara's. There were, in that town, for people who had known for a long time what neither Clara nor I knew about ourselves. Their names were Nell Ferguson, who had sold me the hens, Mabel Corcoran, the schoolteacher, 62, who took her supper at Clara's every Sunday, Halloran, the storekeeper, 51, a widower himself, and Doc Merritt, who was 70 that year and had brought half the town into the world and buried the other half. These four had, among themselves, an ongoing conversation about Ethan and Clara that had been running for going on 3 years, and neither Ethan nor Clara had heard a word of it. Mabel had said that summer, over a plate of Clara's biscuits, he comes every Tuesday. In 4 years he has never once been late by more than an hour, and only then in weather. Do you know what that is, Clara? And Clara had said, that is a man keeping a promise to his cousin. And Mabel had said, that is a man keeping a promise to something. But it isn't his cousin. And Clara had looked at her biscuit and had not answered, and Mabel had let it lie. Halloran had said to me that August, when I came in for nails, you could buy nails in Durango cheaper. Why do you ride to Silverpine for them? And I had said, I like your nails. And Halloran had laughed, one short laugh, and had said, you like something in this town, Ethan Calloway, but I don't think it's my nails. And I had paid and left and had not looked back, because there was a heat in my face I did not want him to see. Doc Merritt had said to Nell, at Christmas, one of them is going to have to break first. It isn't going to be him. And Nell had said, it isn't going to be her either, document. They are both waiting for the other one to do it, and neither one will, and they will both die alone in that town. And Doc had said quietly, then somebody else is going to have to do something. And Nell had said, somebody else can't. This is theirs. That was Christmas of 1888. 9 months later, on a Tuesday in September, Clara asked if I'd stay for coffee. Some things move at the pace of glaciers and creeks. Some things move at the pace of a woman deciding, one sleepless night, that the lamp in her kitchen has been lit for too many years without a name spoken over it. She asked it, I think, because a thing had happened the week before that had turned a key in her, though I did not know it yet. She told me later, sitting at that table with the coffee gone cold between us, that on the previous Sunday, Mabel Corcoran had said to her, over supper, I am moving to my sister's in Denver in the spring. I will not eat at your table anymore, Clara. I want to say, before I go, that I have watched you for 8 years wait for a man who has been standing in your kitchen every Tuesday for 4 of them. I will not say it again. But I have said it once, and now you know I have said it. Clara had not slept that night. She had gone out to the garden at 4 in the morning and pulled weeds by lamplight until her hands were black. She had gone in and made bread. She had made coffee. She had waited for Tuesday. And when I had come through the door with the crate of eggs, and set them on the table, and stood there with my hat in my hand as I had done 208 times, she had heard Mabel's voice in her ear, and she had opened her mouth and she had asked. I said yes. He said. She poured. And for a long minute neither of us spoke, because the asking had used up all the words she had ready, and the saying yes had used up all of mine. Then I said, it's a fine day, because I am a man, and men say foolish things when they are frightened. She said, it is. She said it looking at the coffee, not at me. She said, Ethan, I have to tell you something, and if I don't tell you now I am afraid I never will. And I set my cup down on the pine and I said, then tell me. And she told me. She told me about her husband, whose name was Thomas, who had been 26 when the mine took him, and about her boy, whose name was Samuel, who had been 2 years old and dark-eyed and had loved the sound of a spoon on a tin cup. She told me about the 8 years after, when she had come to Silverpine with the last of Thomas's wages and had bought the boarding house from a family going west, and had built it up from 4 rooms to 6, and had never once, in 8 years, considered a suitor, because she had believed her heart was a house that had already burned down. She told me she had believed that until the second Tuesday of the second year, when I had come in late past supper, and she had said, you didn't have to come today, and I had said, it's Tuesday, and she had understood, standing there in her own kitchen, that her heart was not a house that had burned down. It was a house with a lamp lit in the window, and she had been the one lighting it, every Tuesday, for a man who did not know he was being waited for. She said, I have been waiting for years, Ethan. I did not know how to say it. I am saying it now. If you don't want to stay, drink your coffee and go, and we will never speak of this again, and Tuesday will be Tuesday, and I will not hold it against you, and you have my word. I did not answer right away. I looked at her across the pine table, at the gray eyes and the dark hair pinned high and the long sleeves buttoned at the wrists, and I thought about Sarah on the ridge, and about the 6 years since, and about the 208 Tuesdays, and about the heat in my face outside Halloran's store, and about the way I had, without ever admitting it to myself, timed my chores on Tuesday mornings to be sure I would not be late. Then I said, "Clara, I have been waiting too. I did not know it either. 208 Tuesdays. A man does not ride 4 miles a week in weather for eggs. A man rides 4 miles a week for the woman who counts them." She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. But her hand went flat on the table between us, palm up, and she did not say a word, and after a moment I put my hand over hers, and she closed her fingers, and that was the first time in 6 years I had held a woman's hand, and the first time in 8 years she had held a man's, and neither of us said anything for a long time after that. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. Now, if this were the end of it, it would not be much of a story. Love that announces itself is easy to write and easy to forget. Love that builds a fence, sets a pane of glass, and rides 4 miles in weather without ever saying the word is the kind that outlasts the people who felt it. It would be two lonely people finding each other over a coffee pot in a September kitchen, and there would be a wedding by Christmas, and it would be pleasant, and it would be small. But Silverpine is a small town, and small towns are not always kind to lonely people who wait too long. And there was a man in that town who was going to make it harder before it got easier, and I have not told you about him yet. His name was Everett Pool. He was 39, a widower like me, 3 years widowed, a rancher out west of town with 200 acres and a bad shoulder from a horse fall the year before. He was not a bad man. I want to say that plainly because a lesser story would make him one, and he was not. He was a fair man, a soft-spoken man, and he had, that August, gone to Doc Merritt and asked what Doc thought of him calling on Clara Whitfield. Doc had told him honestly that he thought Clara had her heart set elsewhere, but that Everett was welcome to try, because Doc did not believe in speaking for other people's hearts. Everett had thanked him and had ridden out, and the following Sunday he had come to Clara's for supper and had asked if he might call on her the next week. Clara had said yes because she was a courteous woman and did not know how to say no to a courteous man, and Everett had come on the Thursday and the Thursday after and the Thursday after that. He had brought her, the second time, a bolt of gray wool cloth from Halloran's. She had thanked him. She had not made it into a dress. She had folded it and put it in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, because she did not know what else to do with a gift she had not wanted to receive. On the Thursday of the week I sat at her table for coffee. Everett Pool was due at 6. It was 2 in the afternoon. Clara looked at me across the table, and she said, "Ethan, there is a thing I have to tell you also." And she told me about Everett. She told me plain, and she did not spare herself. She said, "He is a good man. He has come to call 3 Thursdays running. I have not sent him away. I did not know how. I am telling you because you deserve to know before you decide anything, and because I will not have a thing between us begin in a lie." I said, "Do you want him?" She said, "No." I said, "Then tell him." She said, "I will. I will tell him tonight." I said, "I will be here tonight if you'd like." She said, "No. I will do it myself. You did not court me, Ethan. I courted myself into believing you would. He has been honest. He deserves to hear it from me alone." That was Clara. That was always Clara. She would not hide behind a man, not even the one she had waited 8 years for. I understood it, and I did not argue. I finished my coffee, and I stood, and I picked up my hat, and I said, "I will come back tomorrow, if you want me to." And she said, "I want you to." And that was all. I rode home along the creek road. The cottonwoods were turning. The light was the gold you only get in the San Juan Range in the 3rd week of September, when the aspens on the high slopes have started to burn but the valley cottonwoods have not yet given up. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. I felt like a man who had walked into his own house after a long time away, and had found the fire still lit, though he had not, himself, been the one to light it. That evening Everett Pool came to Clara's at 6, as he had said. She met him at the door, and she did not invite him in. She stepped out onto the porch, and she stood on the boards between the door and the top step, and she said what she had come to say. She said, "Mr. Pool, you have been kind, and you have been honest, and I owe you the same. I cannot receive your calls any longer. My heart is spoken for, and has been for longer than I understood it. I did not mean to waste your Thursdays. I am sorry for it. Thank you for your patience and your goodness. I hope you will understand. Everett Pool stood on the top step of her porch, one hand on the rail, and he did not say anything for a long moment. His jaw set once. His eyes went to the boards of the porch, and then to the middle distance, and then back to her face, and a person watching from 3rd Street would have seen a small honest pain cross him and be governed. He drew one long breath. He let it out. Then he spoke. Then he said, "And this is what I want you to hear because it is the mark of the man." He said, "May I ask who?" She said, "Ethan Calloway." He said, "Ethan is a good man. I would not have stood in his way had I known. I wish, ma'am, that you had told me sooner, not because I am owed the telling, but because I could have spared us both the Thursdays. I do not blame you. It is a hard thing to say, a hard thing." He took his hat off then. He held it in both hands. He said, "I brought that bolt of gray wool 3 weeks ago. Keep it. Make of it what you like.
O dress, o blanket, o curtain.
I do not want it back. I want it in your house. As a kindness, not a claim. Good evening, Mrs. Whitfield." And he put his hat back on, and he turned, and he walked down the steps, and he mounted his horse at the rail, and he rode. Clara stood on the porch a long time after he was gone. She told me later she had cried then. Not for him. For the 7 years before him, when there had been no one to say no to. She had needed, she said, the practice. The next morning was a Wednesday, and I came back. I did not sleep much that Tuesday night. I lay in the ranch house with the dog at the foot of the bed and thought about the sound of Clara's voice saying my name across a pine table, and about Everett Pool riding west in the last of the light, and about a lamp in a kitchen that had been burning, apparently, since before I understood I had been the one it was burning for. I came back at 11, when the kitchen was between the breakfast wash-up and the noon meal. I came in through the kitchen door without knocking because I felt I could, and she was at the pine table kneading bread, and she looked up at me and she smiled, the first full smile I had ever seen on her, and I had known her 4 years, and she said, "Well, you're not late." And I said, "It's not Tuesday." And she laughed, one small laugh, and I understood then that I had done a thing I would want to spend the rest of my life doing. We were married in November, at the Methodist Church in Silverpine, on a Saturday morning with 3 inches of new snow on the ground. Doc Merritt gave her away, because her father had been dead 20 years, and she had asked him. Halloran stood with me. Nell Ferguson came up from Pueblo. Mabel Corcoran came down from her sisters in Denver, having gone in October. She had said she would not eat at Clara's table again, and she had not, but she came for the wedding, and she cried in the front pew, and afterward she took Clara's hands in hers and she said, "I told you once. I did not have to tell you again." And Clara had said, "You told me at the right time, Mabel. Not one Sunday sooner or later." And they had held each other, 2 women of a certain kind of strength, and had not said anything more. Everett Pool was at the wedding also. He sat in the 3rd row on the groom's side. He shook my hand afterward and he said, "Calloway, be good to her. You know already, but I will say it anyway." And I said, "Pool, thank you for coming." And he said it was the right thing. And that was all, and I have thought since that Everett Pool was a better man than most, and the town was lucky to have him, and I have thanked him in my head 100 times for the grace of that November Saturday. Now I want to tell you about the windows. I want to tell you about the windows because they matter, and because a story like this one is not really about the coffee or the wedding or even the 8 years of waiting. It is about the windows. After the wedding, Clara kept the boarding house and I kept the ranch, and we split our weeks between the two. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays we were at the ranch. On Thursdays through Sundays we were in town. Mondays we were together, wherever the work was heaviest. It was a strange life at first, but it was the life we had, and we made it work. That first December, I began, without telling her, to rebuild the east wall of the ranch house. The east wall had one small window set high that Sarah and I had put in the summer of '83. It let in almost no morning light. The house faced south and had big windows on that side, but the kitchen, where a person spent a life, faced east onto the mountains, and I had never given Sarah a proper morning window because we had run out of glass that summer, and then Sarah had gotten sick, and then Sarah had died, and the small high window had stayed small and high for 6 years. Now Clara was going to live in that kitchen, and I wanted her to have the light. I ordered the glass from Durango. I ordered it in secret. It came up on the freight wagon the 3rd week of December, and I hid it in the barn under a canvas, and I began, on the days Clara was at the boarding house, to tear out the small high window and cut a bigger opening. I framed it wide. I framed it low. I framed it at the height a woman would stand at a sink, so that when she washed the breakfast dishes she would be looking straight into the San Juan Range in the morning light. I set the new glass myself with putty and a small blade, and I trimmed it with cedar, and I did not tell her. She came out to the ranch on the last Tuesday of December, and she walked into the kitchen, and she stopped in the doorway, and she did not say anything for perhaps a full minute. Then she went to the sink and she stood at it, and she looked out at the mountains in the low winter sun, and she put her hands flat on the counter, and she said one word, "Ethan." I said, "So you'd have good light?" She said, "You didn't say." I said, "I didn't need to." She turned around and she came across the kitchen and she put her arms around me, and her face against my collar, and she did not cry, but she stood there a long time, and I stood with her, and the mountains outside the new window were pink with the winter afternoon. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. A man can spend a year cutting glass and setting cedar for a sentence he will never actually speak. That is a bargain the good ones make with themselves without ever putting it into words. The next spring I mended the pasture fence along the north line, for 100 yards of it, because the posts had gone soft in the wet years, and Clara had said, once, in passing, that she worried about the cattle drifting toward the creek in a hard spring runoff. I did not tell her I was doing it. She came out one Wednesday in April and found me at the last 20 yards, sinking a new post in the black earth, and she stood at the fence line on her side and I stood on mine, and she said, "You are always doing something." And I said, "You said you worried." And she said, "I said it once." And I said, "Once was enough." She reached across the fence and she took my hand over the wire, and we stood like that a moment, one on each side of the line, and I have thought since that a fence line between two people who love each other is not a boundary but a place where two futures meet, and that is where the important things get said, if they get said at all. The summer after that, our second summer, her mother's sewing box came out of the attic at the boarding house. Clara had not opened it in 9 years, since before Samuel had died. In the box was a small tin cup, dented on one side, that had belonged to Samuel, that he had loved the sound of a spoon on. She held it in her hands a long time. She did not cry then either. She was still not a woman who cried in front of people. But that evening she gave the cup to me and she said, "Do a thing with this. I do not know what. Something that stays." And I took the cup out to the ranch and I built her a small shelf above the new east window, and I set the tin cup on the shelf, and I did not say anything about it, and she came the next Tuesday and she saw it, and she went to the sink and she stood at the counter and she looked at the cup on the shelf against the morning light and she said, "Thank you." And that was all. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. We had a daughter in the fall of '91. We named her Mabel Sarah Calloway. Mabel came down from Denver for the christening, and she held the child and she said, "Well, you did not need me after all." And Clara said, "We needed you for the telling, Mabel, not for the doing. The doing was ours." And Mabel had cried again, and this time Clara had cried with her, and the two women had sat in the boarding house kitchen at the pine table where I had sat and drunk coffee 2 years before, and they had cried together for a long time, and I had stayed outside on the porch with the child and had let them have it, because some rooms are not for men. I want to end this story where it began. I want to end it in a September kitchen with a crate of eggs on a pine table and a coffee pot on a stove. Because in the September of our 5th year of marriage, the fall of '94, I came in from the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with the eggs, out of habit and out of love, and I set them on the pine table, and Clara looked up from the bread she was kneading, and she said, "Ethan, stay for coffee." And I said, "I will." And she poured and we sat, and the light through the east window of her kitchen, the one in town, not the one at the ranch because I had built her one in each place by then, was gold on the pine table between us. And she said, "Quiet, it is a fine day." And I said, "It is." That was all. I want to say one thing more, and then I will let you go. If you have been waiting a long time for something you cannot quite name, if you have been tending a lamp in a window for a person who does not know he is being waited for, or if you have been the one riding 4 miles a week to a kitchen you did not know was yours, I want to say to you what Mabel Corcoran said to Clara Whitfield on the porch of a boarding house in Silverpine, Colorado, in the September of 1889. She said, "You do not have to say it more than once, but say it once. Because the ones who are waiting for you cannot always find the door on their own, and sometimes a woman must ask a man in for coffee, and sometimes a man must build a window that faces east, and sometimes an old schoolteacher must say the true thing at a Sunday supper before she moves to Denver, and sometimes the whole of a life turns on one plain sentence that a person has practiced in the mirror, in the barn, in the dark." She asked if I'd stay for coffee. I didn't know she had been waiting for years, and I have thought in the years since that I had been waiting too and did not know it, and that is the shape of most of the good love in this world. Two people waiting on either side of a fence line, each thinking the other one will speak first, until at last one of them, on an ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary kitchen, sets down the crate and pours the coffee and says the plain small sentence that opens the rest of a life. "Thank you for sitting with me at the pine table today. Thank you for letting Ethan and Clara into your kitchen, and thank you for staying for the coffee." If this story warmed a corner of your morning, come back next week. I have another one waiting for you, about a widower on the Purdory River who took in a stranger's child one November night, and about the letter that came 6 months later that changed everything he thought he knew about his own name. Until next time, keep riding.